Welcome to Week 7 matchups that matter. Today we're going to break down everything you need to know to set your best fantasy football lineup ahead of Week 7 fantasy football. We're going to break down over-unders, implied point totals, Bipocalypse this week. A lot of stuff to discuss, so definitely stay tuned all the way to the end of this video. But now let's get into it. All right, so as I mentioned off the top, it is officially Bipocalypse. We have 6 teams on bye this week, which means you will be without your Carolina Panthers, Cincinnati Bengals, Dallas Cowboys, Houston Texans, New York Jets, and Tennessee Titans. A lot of bye weeks this week, 6 teams, a lot of injuries as well to the quarterback position especially, so we're getting real grimy in Week 7 of fantasy football. We're going to have to dig a little bit deeper this week than we typically do, but let's kick things off with the over-unders of the week. You guys can see the top 5 over-unders according to Vegas totals right now. Eagles and Dolphins on Sunday Night Football looks to be the crown jewel of the slate, as well as Chiefs-Chargers in the late Sunday window as well. This week's slate does not appear to be very high scoring, so really keep that in mind when it comes to your start-sit decisions. It's probably smart to lean into usage this week, more so than game environment, because we only have one game over a 50-point over-under. We only have 2 games over a 45-point over-under, and those 2 games could really carry you if you have players from that game as well. So maybe if you do have, let's say A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, guys like that, maybe you lean a little bit more conservative with your decisions in other areas. Last week, we saw only 15 fantasy players go over 20-plus PPR points per game. This week, we might see something similar. And to put that in perspective, in Week 4, we saw 33 players go over 20-plus PPR points, and in Week 5, we saw 29. So it was a lower scoring slate last week, and I expect it to probably be a lower scoring slate again this week. Probably a lot of very close matchups in your fantasy football league. So if you have a guy that can go off for a monster game, maybe you lean towards him, or you play it conservative in other areas. And some of the games that we do not expect a lot of points in, that Buccaneers-Falcons game, Chicago Bears, Las Vegas Raiders, New York Giants and Washington Commanders, and then Colts and Browns, and then Saints and Jaguars on Thursday Night Football tonight. So a lot of games with rougher point totals. Most likely we'll have to still start a lot of these players because of all the bye weeks and injuries, but keep that in mind if you are starting players from these games. They are not expected to have a very high-scoring game environment. So in terms of implied point totals, which of course work off of the spreads and the over-under of the game, not a big-time scoring game from the implied totals as well. We've had 5 teams over 27 implied points on previous weeks. This week, the only team over 27 implied points is the Philadelphia Eagles, and only a couple teams over 25. So not a great situation from a scoring perspective. Patriots, Bears, Falcons, Vikings, and Giants all under 19 implied points on the week, so maybe you want to leave those guys on your bench. Then when we get to where the sharps are betting, you guys can see the Steelers and Los Angeles Rams game is the only game on the entire slate that the sharps are taking the over in. So again, that should tell you a lot about this slate of games and why we probably aren't expecting a lot of points. They like the over in that game, but it is the only one. And a lot of these games have a lot of the money on the under right now, including that Patriots-Bills game, the Colts-Browns, Bears-Raiders, Commanders and Giants, and Chiefs and Chargers. A lot of those games, minus the Chiefs and Chargers games, already had low over-unders to begin with. Considering a lot of these totals are expected to be low already, and the sharps are liking the under, again, further hammering home that point that we're getting a lower scoring fantasy football slate this week. Then when it comes to the advanced data points, so these are things like pace of play combined of the 2 teams, as well as how good is one offense going up against the opposing defense in terms of defensive and offensive DVOAs. So the fastest paced games of the slate, Colts, Browns, Chiefs, Chargers, Saints, and Jaguars tonight, and then Patriots, Bills, and Vikings, 49ers. Looks like we're checking a lot of boxes for this Chiefs-Chargers game to go over, as well as this Vikings-49ers game as well. Good game environment probably on Monday night. Assuming all the 49ers players are healthy, they should be in a really, really good spot. Then when it comes to the slowest pace games, these are ones that you're going to want to avoid if possible. That Giants-Commanders game is not checking a lot of boxes so far. Neither is the Bears-Raiders, Buccaneers-Falcons, or Baltimore-Ravens and Detroit Lions game. And then that Broncos-Packers game also expected to be the slowest on the entire slate. Offensive DVOA versus opponent's defensive DVOA. So the far left column, how good is their offense relative to a league average situation? That'll be the middle column there, offensive DVOA. And then how good is the week 7 opponents column, defense against opposing offenses. So you guys can see some of the biggest advantages are to be expected, right? The Miami Dolphins, the Buffalo Bills, the Philadelphia Eagles. We know that they are really good offenses, ergo they're going to have a good matchup advantage on most weeks. But the two teams I want to point your attention to are the Seattle Seahawks, who have the best matchup advantage on the entire slate by a decent margin as well, going up against the Arizona Cardinals. So definitely fire up your Seattle Seahawks players, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Kenneth Walker, maybe even a low-end flex play of Jackson Smith and Jigba if you're really desperate this week. Then also the Green Bay Packers have a cake matchup against the Denver Broncos' brutal pass defense and run defense. Good spot for Christian Watson, good spot for Romeo Doubs, good spot for Aaron Jones. I think you could do worse if you had to start like a Jaden Reed or something like that. And also a good streaming spot for Jordan Love if you're in need of a quarterback. So some of the biggest disadvantages on the week. So these are teams we don't want to be starting players from. You guys could see the New England Patriots, the New York Giants, Los Angeles Rams, Indianapolis Colts, and Atlanta Falcons, all expected to be matchup disadvantages. Bad offenses going up against good defenses. Never a good recipe for fantasy success most of the time. Still fire up the usual guys. Of course, you're not going to sit Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua or Saquon Barkley or anybody like that. But anybody that's on the fringe, Wan'Dale Robinson types, Kendrick Bourne types, guys like that, Tutu Atwell types, maybe leave those guys on your bench. Not a good situation for them this week. Now let's move on to the shadow coverage matchups this week. So, of course, anything in green is a matchup upgrade for the fantasy football wide receivers in question. Anything in yellow is about a neutral matchup downgrade or matchup upgrade, and then anything in red is a matchup downgrade. So we have some tougher matchups on the docket for these players in red that you guys can see there. Mike Evans is expected to see shadow coverage from A.J. Terrell of the Atlanta Falcons. Not a good matchup for Mike Evans. He's notoriously been, up and down against A.J. Terrell, so keep that in mind for him. Probably still in your lineup, but a matchup downgrade. Calvin Ridley expected to see a lot of Marshawn Lattimore tonight on Thursday Night Football, so not a good matchup for him, and maybe an upgrade spot for both number 2 receivers, respectively. Chris Godwin in a good spot there, as well as Christian Kirk. Deontay Johnson and George Pickens going up against the Rams secondary. Not a good matchup for those guys. That secondary's been overperforming expectations. Even though Deontay is back, the Steelers offense is not one that I really trust. Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams, also a tough matchup against the Ravens corners. And then Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. Probably want to leave Downs especially on your bench, but really temper expectations for Michael Pittman Jr. against that Browns secondary. They have been the best in the league against fantasy football wide receivers. Just one neutral matchup this week. We have Christian Watson expected to see shadow coverage from Patrick Surtain. It looks like when the Denver Broncos deploy shadow coverage, it's usually only at the left wide receiver spot, so there will be opportunities for Christian Watson to work away from Surtain, but also keep that in mind if you guys have Romeo Doubs, it might be a good spot for him with Christian Watson seeing a good portion of the Patrick Surtain coverage there. So keep that in mind for the Green Bay Packers. And then when it comes to matchup upgrades, so guys that are in really good spots, guys that we want to be putting into our fantasy football lineups, we see A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. Giddy up for them against the Dolphins corners. Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, as I already mentioned. Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua in good spots from a wide receiver matchup standpoint. And then also Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, Wan'Dale Robinson in the slot against Danny Johnson. Again, I talked about some of these guys when it comes to their overall offensive DVOAs are not good, but these individual wide receivers actually have some half-decent matchups. Terry McLaurin expected to see a lot of Adoree Jackson. He should be really good in that matchup. And then tonight, Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, and Rashid Shaheed should be able to get some work done against the Jacksonville Jaguars secondary as well. So now we're going to get into our starts of the week. So our top 5 matchups for quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. And then some guys that we're probably streaming who are kind of not really every week starters, but because they have good matchups, they could be viable streamers this week. And then our bottom 5 matchups for quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, guys that are going to be sits this week. So let's start it off with the quarterback position. Looking at the top 5 matchups, you can see that Patrick Mahomes is in a pretty good spot. Of course, he's an every week starter, so he would be in your lineup regardless, but a lot of good streamers this week as well. I already talked about Jordan Love as a guy that has a really good matchup against the Denver Broncos. They've been horrible against fantasy quarterbacks, fantasy running backs, fantasy anything really. And then we also have a really good spot for Geno Smith as well, who I talked about with the Seattle Seahawks. So if you're looking for a streaming quarterback this week, Geno could be your guy. If you're really desperate, I probably would say that if Daniel Jones plays, he's a decent option, but I probably wouldn't mess with Jimmy Garoppolo if he plays, and or Brian Hoyer or Aiden O'Connell, whoever starts for the Las Vegas Raiders, although it is good to know that they have a good matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. That's good news for Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers as well. Quarterbacks who do not have good matchups, you guys can see Gardner Minshew, Mac Jones, Derek Carr. Do not put these guys in your lineup. They are to stay on the bench or to stay on waivers where they're probably located right now. And then also temper expectations for Jared Goff, who's been really good in recent weeks, but not a good matchup this week against the Baltimore Ravens. And then also a bad matchup for Justin Herbert. The Chiefs secondary, Chiefs defense in general has been very strong against fantasy football quarterbacks, against the passing game as well. So keep that in mind for Justin Herbert, but those guys are probably both still in your lineup. Although if you had like a Jared Goff versus Geno Smith decision or a Jared Goff versus Jordan Love decision, I'd probably sit Jared Goff on the bench if you guys could help it as well. Now let's move on to the running back position. Some of the top matchups this week go to Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker, DeAndre Swift. Those guys are all in really good matchups. Good luck if you got to face against these guys, because I'm sure they're going to go hog wild against some very exploitable run defenses. And then two other guys with good matchups. We have Aaron Jones, who is now practicing in full. He should be greeted by one of the easiest matchups in the league. The Denver Broncos give it up to the fantasy running back position. So I'm pretty excited about Aaron Jones bouncing back this week after a couple weeks off. And then the Denver Broncos backfield, which was a three-way timeshare on Thursday night last week. Javonte Williams is the preferred starter in my opinion. He's a fine top 24 to 30 running back start this week, especially on a shallow week. You probably won't have a choice but to put him into your lineup, but I'm also not convinced that Jaleel McLaughlin and Samaje Perine are just going to go away here. So keep that in mind with the Denver Broncos backfield. Some of the tougher matchups at running back, you can see temper expectations for Austin Eckler, for Travis Etienne, for Bijan Robinson, for the Steelers running backs, Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, and then also for the Baltimore Ravens running backs, Justice Hill and Gus Edwards. You maybe want to leave those guys on your bench if you can help it, but imagine a lot of you guys don't have a choice but to start Justice Hill this week, given all the bye weeks and all of the injuries. So the wide receiver position, let's talk about some of these guys. I already touched on some of them with the shadow matchups, but I already mentioned the Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. Make sure you go buy low on Devontae Smith before this week comes up, because he's had some down games, and this could be a get-right spot for him against the Miami Dolphins in a 52-point over-under game. The Raiders wide receivers, as I already talked about, are in a good spot against the Chicago Bears. The Packers wide receivers, as I mentioned with Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, also in a good spot this week. And then also Amari Cooper is in a great situation this week, but it is going to be P.J. Walker probably again at quarterback, so keep that in mind. I probably wouldn't start Elijah Moore or any other Browns pass catchers other than Amari Cooper, knowing that P.J. Walker is probably not going to be a very good option. And then tough matchup on the other side of that game, the Colts wide receivers, Josh Downs and Michael Pittman. If you can sit them, do it, but you probably can't help it with Michael Pittman especially. The Bears wide receivers, again, I don't want to start these guys. DJ Moore is probably going to have to be in your lineup for most cases, but with Tyson Bagent starting at quarterback, it's not going to be a very pretty sight, especially against a Raiders defense that's been surprisingly good against fantasy football wide receivers. And then also be sure to temper expectations for some of these studs: Keenan Allen, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk. I'd probably sit all other Chargers, Lions, and Jags wide receivers other than the names I just mentioned, but also temper expectations for the guys that I just mentioned as well. So the tight end position, some of the biggest tight end matchup advantages this week could bode well for a lot of you guys that are in need of tight ends, or maybe you're streaming the tight end position, because Luke Musgrave, Pat Freiermuth, and Michael Mayer, all widely available tight ends that I actually really like rest of season as well as like top 15 options. They're all good streamers this week. They have good matchups, the Broncos, the Rams, and then also the Bears against the fantasy football tight end position. So if you guys are in need of a tight end, or your current tight end isn't working out, hell, even if you have like a Cole Kmet type or a guy that's just not a locked and loaded every week starter, definitely pick up one of these guys if they're available and kind of see what happens. You don't have to start them necessarily, but I do think they're all in good spots to potentially boost their value going forward. And also keep an eye on Dalton Kincaid as well, because he should be back this week, and the Patriots have been exploitable against the tight end position. He might be the next rookie tight end who becomes a very hot waiver ad, like we saw with Michael Mayer this past week. And then tough sledding for Kyle Pitts, tough sledding for Evan Ingram, and for Sam Laporta as well. But unfortunately, at the tight end position, you don't have better options, so those guys are still in your lineup. And then leave Tyler Higbee and then the Cardinals tight ends, Zach Ertz and Trey McBride, on your bench, because those guys are basically splitting that tight end position 50-50 at this point, and that is no bueno from a fantasy perspective. So finally, let's close it out with the sicko watch, right? You guys who play with defense defenses and kickers still. Probably want to know who are good streaming defenses, who are good streaming kickers. Of course, the Buffalo Bills are a premier streaming defense this week, but they are probably rostered in a lot of fantasy leagues. If you guys are looking for widely owned defenses, I think the Rams defense going up against the Steelers is a good option. The Colts defense going up against PJ Walker is a good option. Giants defense against Sam Howell is a good option. Buccaneers defense against Desmond Ridder. All viable options there. I think my favorites there are the Buccaneers and the Rams. If they are available in your league, go out and get them. And then as far as kicker talk, if you guys need a good kicker option, take the Buffalo Bills kicker, Cleveland Browns kicker, Detroit Lions kicker, Green Bay Packers kicker. All of these guys are going to be good options for you. So again, if you enjoyed this video, if I helped you set your fantasy football lineup, leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. If you want access to all of these charts, every piece of information I used is available in our weekly rankings manifesto. You can get our weekly rankings that way by, seeing who we have ranked higher. That's who we would start or sit. And also you can use our weekly rankings to make your own decisions by looking over some of this information, checking off the pros and cons of each player in whatever start sit decision you have, and then use that to make your decisions as well, knowing that you're using some sound process. So if that interests you, definitely check that out in the pinned comment down below. Of course, be sure to check out our site, flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSE will get you 30% off any of the packages. It'll get you our rest of season rankings, our weekly rankings, like I just mentioned, as well as our dynasty rankings and all the bonus content and articles from some of your other fantasy football creators as well. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.